And putting it together, I learned quite a bit about myself. And it's a continuing education when you begin to examine this. So I wanted to emphasize, based on the questions this morning, is that in filling out that worksheet, you wanted to have the earliest memories of a child that you can bring forth between the ages of 3 and 6. Because in that age, your unconscious mind is closest to your conscious mind. And I use the example of a friend of mine whose little 3-year-old boy walked in one day in the afternoon, and she was laying on the couch and says, "Charlie, do you remember when I was your father?" Right out of the mouth of a babe. And so it's incredible that it's those memories that are so close that you can tap into. And as you do the workshop, you'll find that more and more of those memories will come about. The other thing is that, does anybody have any questions that were here yesterday that you...
Well, the question about this, what if your memories are before 3 years old? Or is that too young to... I have memories of being like 6 months old, a year old. Do I want to go for the memories that are between 3 and 6 years old? Or if I'm 6-month-old memories, is that okay?
Yes, yeah, certainly. Earliest memories. I think I mentioned yesterday I was 2 years old when my youngest brother was born, and all the ladies and whatnot in the neighborhood were around Mama's bed and they hold the eye of the baby, and I'm sitting in the living room feeling I've been neglected, so I decided to run away. So at 2 years old, I ran down to the end of the block, a long block, and at the house at the end there'd been a death, and they were carrying the body into the hearse from the house. And I turned around and went back home. So that was my earliest memory, as it was at age 2 that happened. Also, somebody asked me about next lifetime, next experience. A very profound mystic made this comment, but I've also had some insight personally before I had mentioned it to this person, that people on the spiritual path today here will find themselves together in China in a future life, near future, within the next 100, 200 years. So China seems to be the place of opportunity for spiritual motivated people. So our talk today is about the spiritual path. And there was a lesson that Jesus of Nazareth taught us as an example, and the lesson of the prodigal son. So if you remember the story, the prodigal son was born and raised in the house of luxury, literally, the father's house. But out in the distance there was this glimmer of the shining city. And so the son went to his father and says, "I want to visit the shining city. Give me my inheritance and forget that you have a son." Off he went. So he lived up the high life, indulging himself in every indulgence that the glittering city had to offer, until the indulgence began to increase, because they got old after a while and you had to keep increasing the stimulus, until he had run out of all of his funds and all of his physical energy and found himself literally in the gutter. And when he was there at that lowest ebb, he remembered his father's house, and he resolved to get up and go back to the house. But the way back was much harder than getting to the city in the first place. So as he struggled along the way, word came to his father that his son was returning, and he ran out and met him and embraced him. And the son said, "If I'm sorry I left your house, make me a lowest service in your house so I can come back." And the father was having none of that. He said, "Rejoice, bring out the cloak and the shoes, and let's have a banquet. My son has come back." That's my story. I'm the prodigal. Each one of you are the prodigal. There was no condemnation from the father. The thing is that in the spiritual path, we have an intellectual aspect and we have a feeling aspect. And it's only when the heart is moved that the soul begins to waken. The spiritual path is a whole different lifestyle. And there are two aspects of that spiritual path. But you have to really feel and desire that this is what you want. Much of the problem in Western Christianity was the idea that you had one life to live, according to St. Paul, and then you die and you are judged. And St. Paul is exactly right. There's only going to be one Edward Jamail for this soul. And when this life is done, the soul will judge this life of Edward Jamail. But I am more than just Edward Jamail. And so are you, much more than the personality that you have now. So Paul was right. And the awakening comes when our heart is into the spiritual path. I began to say, and I will repeat again, our problem in the West was this idea of one life to live and then you die and you are judged and that's it. And that's not it at all. It's a journey that the soul is undertaking. And the more you get into the spiritual, we have this idea that the earth is bad, the physical body is bad, and oh, I've done this, and oh, I've done that, and I've got to go to confession, I've got to repent, I've got to go up and beat the drum, or whatever you believe. Somehow you have to make amends. You don't. All those things, when you review your life, look at them as a learning experience. They came to you for a purpose. You can say, well, I handled that pretty good. Or you can say, well, I need a little more work in this area. But you're not beating yourself over the back. You see the life as a journey. So we delude ourselves a lot about this life. And the more you get into that spiritual aspect and begin to raise your consciousness, you see this life is truly wonderful. And the higher you get into that conscious mind, this earth and the life in this earth becomes paradise. You don't have to go somewhere to be in paradise. And that's why the spiritual path for me in the last 5 or 10 years of my life has begun to be fun. And that's how I begin to see the world and life and everything that happens. So anyway, in many aspects, the souls we see are asleep. So this life is basically a farce. Basically, the physical life that I've had before this time was really a farce. All the things that I thought were interested and all the things that I was doing. So all the great avatars in the world have given us one command. Basically, it's wake up. Wake up, that's all. Just open your eyes, expand your consciousness. The only significance of the earthly life is the return to the Father's house. That's the only significance. And that creates a desire that comes from the house. I want to return to the Father's house. And again, the words we use limit us in a way. Return. It's not that I'm going anywhere and returning. It's that I'm bringing the Father's house here into my life and into my circumstances. So we began the slow path and descent, like the prodigal son. And now we begin the return back. The path can be found in the essential teachings of all the great avatars. We're familiar with Jesus of Nazareth. I am more familiar with the Buddha after Jesus of Nazareth, but all of them. Many of the saints that are mentioned in the Hindu tradition, in the Vedas, all of these people were talking the same thing. Wake up. So many of the people believe these teachings. They don't practice belief. Belief is an aspect of the mind. And so What I'm saying is that the teachings don't practice them. The belief is simply the mental acceptance. It's maybe the first step to the actual practice. So whenever the heart is moved, then the soul begins to wake up. It starts with the heart. And the spiritual path requires of its followers that path is the first thing in their life. So what does awakening to the past consist of? We are in a three-dimensional universe, and it consists of the body, the mind, the emotions, and the soul. So basically, we're talking about dealing with the body, the purging, and the purification. Now that has kind of negative aspects also, purging, but we're dealing with the body. And first of all, that means is keeping the body as fit as possible using perhaps some form of exercise. That gets the circulation moving. Getting the circulation moving removes the impurities that build up. All the food we eat, there's a residue, and it's in the bloodstream and everything else, purities. Some of the things we eat, some of the things we drink, some of the atmosphere we may be exposed to, we've got to purge the body of the negative influences. So part of that is a little exercise. Maybe it's nothing more than being able to sit in a chair and do things like this. Ideally, it's also taking a brisk walk later on in the afternoon, say, early evening. Then you have to reduce the heavy proteins in your diet. That's kind of gets hard for a lot of us, doing away eventually with red meats. I haven't myself exactly gotten rid of the red meats. I enjoy a hamburger every once in a while, but I don't eat red meats much at all. Basically, I'll have chicken or occasionally fish, but I am moving toward a vegetarian diet for the most part. And that diet, vegetarian, ideally, will consist of 3 vegetables grown above the ground to 1 vegetable grown below the ground. That sends the chemical reaction of the food that you eat and the ability for the body to assimilate it. 3 above to 1 below. Also, doing away with alcohol. I still like occasional glass of red wine a couple of times a week. But when you really get serious about the spiritual path, you will do away with the alcohol. Now we're dealing with the body. We're preparing the body to be the vehicle for the spirit. So the less the body draws attention to itself, the more the mind can focus on the emotions and the mental attitude. So in the emotions, that takes more time. We've grown up in a very emotional world, and we tend to react to what other people do and say, and we have a feeling about it. So we're caught in this web of like and dislikes when it comes to the emotions. Like, dislike, love, hate, good, evil, security, insecurity, light, darkness, giving, taking. What are we saying? It's the duality. If all is one, there is no duality. So we've got to begin to condition the emotions away from duality. And the world is against us. Almost everything in the world, everything in our immediate environment, not just the world, but right here, tends to be against the idea of oneness when you stop and think about it. So, serenity of the mind is the constant effort. It requires mindfulness and self-awareness to become totally mindful and self-aware. Jesus told us, lay not your treasures upon the earth, and your heart is where your treasure is. So you see, it's getting back to that heart and the idea about that. Anybody have any questions at the...
I don't know, it just kind of sounds like there's so much about returning to the spiritual aspects of everything. weren't we spirits put in a physical body? Isn't there anything just great about being physical, that we just return to being physical beings?
What did you last part did you say?
And most of what I'm hearing you say, it has to do with being more just spiritual and less about just being physical and just being part of this experience.
I can only talk to you about myself,
Okay.
my experience. The more spiritually aware I became, practicing the prayer and the meditation, the more I began to really appreciate the physical and having it. The physical's not bad. You're getting into bad and good, you see.
Am I in bad and good, or am I in just kind of like? I'm kind of like wondering about the flow. Is there a lot of flow towards the spiritual? We're trying to be, like we're trying to be almost without the physical body.
The body is a vehicle, and this is a vast universe, and there are several dimensions, and we have several bodies operating in several places, and they're not like this Homo sapiens.
Yeah.
I've had an idea, a vision, if you want, way back in my own personal journey in the future, and I find myself walking along a seashore. And I always hope that no matter how spiritual I've become, there will be a seashore to walk along. And so I'm not, you see me limping and I've got all these aches and pains and things, but I think the body's a wonderful thing, and I'm thankful that I can limp. And as you begin to work with this and work on improving the body as a vehicle for the spirit, in your next life, your body will be more and more healthy.
Okay.
And less susceptible to anything that comes along.
All right, I love what you're saying.
So the body,
I'm with you 100%.
yeah, the body's improving. You're improving rather, and the body will be the result of your mental improvement. That answered?
Yes.
Okay. Dealing with the mind, this means concentration, basically in meditation. And the mind is a good servant, but a terrible master. Okay? So the results of practice are cumulative, and no effort is wasted. And that's the thing, is that the more effort you make toward the meditation, the more you will be able to get into that silence, and that will improve with lifetimes as you go on and on and on. Now, why am I saying that? I said there's two ways on the spiritual path. We can walk out into the desert or climb a mountain, get in a cave, and sit there and meditate until we get it. We become Christ consciousness, which is defined as knowing ourselves to be ourself and yet one with the whole. So most of us can't go out into a desert or get into a cave in a mountain and sit there and focus. Jesus went into the desert. He came out of the desert as Christ. Buddha went under the bo tree after practicing all of the Hindu traditions, diet, fasting, prayer, all of that stuff. He tried all of the techniques offered by Hinduism and finally said, I'm going to go sit under this tree until I get it. Well, we can't do that, so we do it in increments. And the wonderful thing about doing it in increments like that, beginning to rise more and more into our conscious mind, is that time fades. I'm not going to be Christ in this lifetime, and it doesn't bother me at all, because I can see and feel the progress as I go along. So this is the thing, it's a cumulative effect. I'm looking forward to the next lifetime. Somebody asked me once, when I become the Christ, that'll be it. she actually says, I look forward to getting out of the world. And I had to laugh, because when you become Christ conscious, you'll be involved in the world like never before, because Christ consciousness requires you to come back and help your brother and your sister, because actually you're one with the brother and the sister. So those who are Christ conscious are going to come back. And that's why the mystic told us that those on the spiritual path in the near future, within the next 200 years, we'll all be together in China on the spiritual path. I'm looking forward to it.
Why China? Any particular reason China?
I don't know the details of that. I'm repeating some of this. Some of you weren't here. The only tour I took with a group of people in my life was to China back in late 70s, early 80s. And because it was China, I decided I wanted to be with a group of American people. And China had just opened up to those tours. But I went there with all my resistance: anti-Red Guard, anti-Mao Zedong, anti-communism. But I was kind of curious about China itself, its ancient history and things like that. So we got into China, and I absolutely fell in love. I was totally captivated, head over heels. The people, the food, the scenery, the music, everything. So I went to the leader of the group, who was a mystic himself, but never promoted himself. And I told him, I said, look, I came here with all this resistance, and look what it's done to me. I've fallen in love with it. Why? And he says, because in the near future, you will be in China, that all of the people on the spiritual path within the next 200 years will be in China, on the spiritual path. So that's where the education evidently has to be, in China. They've gone from atheistic communism to very severe materialism. So you can see where the spiritual path might be necessary in China.
Like I heard you saying that. I heard you say that there's like the ancient knowledge in China, that since then there's been kind of a spiritual awakening that's kind of gone around the world. It's literally coming back to China because it has continued to move to the West as it's gone around the world, and it's coming back.
No. Well, we talked a little bit about yesterday, individual spiritual progress. We also move in groups. And I related one of my previous lives. I've never had a reading or hypnotism or anything like that. I experienced them, which changed my life with a near-death experience. But I was in Egypt, and there were two forces in Egypt. There was the king and the high priest. I was the king's man. Most spiritual people were with the high priest. Well, the king had to get rid of the priest for absolute authority, so he exiled him on a trumped-up charge. And I was the king's man that made sure he got out of the country, got to the border. So in this lifetime, I know who the king was, and he and I were just like this, much older man than myself. But now we're on the spiritual path. And this is where the king got on the spiritual path, was this lifetime. So it's interesting. We come into as groups, but we're not always on the same page as a group. So too nations. And if the motivation of a national group is spiritually oriented, basically, then that nation will be successful. But if it's not, if they lose that spiritual orientation, then the spirits of the souls that are creative and innovative and all of that will move west, ever westward. And we've seen that movement historically around the whole world, always westward. The problem of being successful is it spoils us, the luxuries of success. And that's what we have to be aware of. The United States was founded on wonderful ideas. Justice, security, general welfare, as in the preamble to the Constitution. We better live up to it as a nation. So anyway, that's the mental part. Every effort we put into it is a benefit. And like I say, it's cumulative. And as I said also, that as you practice this, time loses its importance. And you get a broader spectrum, broader view of time. So the next aspect, the first three that we talked to about the body, the mind, and the emotions all deal with self. Okay? The next part is our spirit, and that deals outside of ourself. You want to take a seat? Okay. So, in the spirit, it's a life of service. When you get more and more into the spirit, now you're walking outside of yourself in more of a life of service. So the discipline is external and concerns our relationships with the world and with other people. And it calls for selfless love. And here I'd like to quote something from Hinduism, Krishna. It says, "One who experiences the unity of all life sees one's own self in all beings in oneself." So we get back to that oneness. That's the spirit in action. Jesus said the same thing. "Inasmuch as you do this to the least of these, you do it to me." So basically we have the same teachings, and they're actually an archway which we're going through, and there are two supports for that archway. One is love and the other is trust. So there's nothing wasted. And as you move more and higher into the consciousness, you begin to, time changes. And it doesn't matter lifetimes, because you have that, not patience, because we think that patience is something that you endure. For me, I've completely changed patience. Patience is being creative and doing a little bit at a time in the right sequence. It's no more enduring anything. And when you're creating something, time doesn't matter. And that's how I feel about patience. So that's the talk today about the spiritual path. There are two parts. You can go find a cave or a mountaintop, or go out into the desert and pray and meditate until you become Christ conscious. Move into the highest aspect of your own consciousness. The superego, Carl Jung called it in psychology. Or you begin with step by step, doing what you can now. Prayer, a little bit of meditation every day, stepping aside, getting quiet. I'll share again something that you're probably bored of hearing. I've developed, first of all, I do meditate by going and getting in a place where it's quiet and sitting there about 15, 20, 30 minutes. But I also do a mini meditation all during the day, and that has to do with breath work. So as you breathe in and you feel the energy rising up through the chakras of the body to the very top of your head, where you cannot take in another breath. Think about it. At that point, you're in the silence. And that's what you want in the meditation, that silence. Then you very slowly exhale and see the energy flow down. It doesn't take you a minute to do that. And you can do it anywhere, driving down the road, working, anywhere. So a little meditation every day, and it becomes cumulative. Well, that's it. Anybody have any questions or comments? The spiritual path. Thank you.
Gather up, Dave.
That's a chat.
Gather up, Dave.
Yeah, gather up.
Force of kind of circular thing.
Yes, there is peace on earth, and yes, it begins all are we. Let me walk with my family in perfect harmony. Yes, peace begins with me, and this is the moment now. With every step I take, let this be my joyous vow, to take each moment and live each moment in peace eternally. Yes, there is peace on earth, and yes, it begins with me. The light of God surrounds us, the love of God enfolds us, the power of God protects us, and the presence of God watches over us. Wherever we are, God is, and all is well. Amen.
Did you feel that little electricity?
so much.
You know what?
Yes,
I kind of looked at my hand and I go, it definitely cuts for serious.
I thought we're all
Looking forward to the next time.
It's amazing as always. You could talk for an hour.
Thank you. Let me have your attention for a moment.
It's okay.
We had a worksheet, and you want to basically
Got like a little electrical
step
thing.
back and look
It's still
over
in
the
there.
face sheet, the worksheet, and you get a profile of a life that mostly impacts this life. Now, I think that Charlotte has extra copies of that worksheet for those who were not here.
Oh, I set it on the back. Oh, thank you.
Yeah. It's a good
I know
worksheet.
it gave me, it ended up being.
Yeah, sorry I missed it. I'd be accused of
You can still do it.
Yeah, I intend to.
The worksheet brought
Under Tuesdays,
back a lot of things that I
shared. Not this coming Monday, but the one
Remember,
after. It's gonna be
yeah,
later.
yeah,
we've got a lot of
But
it started
it is,
jelly.
giving work before then. She was
Yeah, it builds over a period of time. The more you look at it,
one of them.
the more fun.
Facebook.
One was
So
that.
you can sit there, I forgot, it's like we're here and, I'm thinking about Facebook. What I was about.
She just rolls out.
I wouldn't sleep
Where you
voters, my mother.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I can't wait to do it. Me too.
I'd forgotten that story, but it came back to me that I told you for George Morrison.
You were probably there.
Let me go into
That's why those childhood memories
I'm okay with 3 times as much.
And they what that was, I don't know, but you still kind of remember that. He's been let down, but he still remembers that. And he says,
That's not what I want to
she doesn't drink like it, I think, but
he's had an experience with Michael,
he's had something.
and it had to do with purpose in his life. And Michael was the thing that he realizes that
Anything
purpose.
I find on our case, I'll give it to him. Did I just talk about Michael? He sat on his, inside to him. You see the lights around.
Hi, how are you?
Very good.
Is he into the
No, not at this time. You know, he, like I said, he got married, I always have with him. But Michael was still in his house.
Oh, yeah. Well, we'll come back to that.
Yeah, I did down the road.
I know a lot of children that were very profound as they got into
Early 20s, somebody was possibly just see where they're at.
Oh, they're ready.
I feel like I will come back.
You're probably the prodigal. He has to exhaust that talent and then get back to his original. But it's still standing.
That's why anything on my phone, I just slide it over. That's where he's at right now.
In play for him, he's the highest score.
But Michael's still with me. I know, I can't see that, so I know he's still with him.
Michael's the guardian of the way, traditionally speaking.
It was just so, when he was, it was so. I never did. He said, oh, the ceiling fan is like doing. That's wonderful. I always just listen, just tell him anything. Whatever. Yeah, but I just listened to him. It was fascinating.
Every once in a while, you can throw it over here.
We still listen to Grandma a little bit. He started out in this world, he was life counselor, and out there, he was old. And he's made it for a long time. Oh my yards, but he'll come back.
Yeah, he still hangs Michael. You'll see that every day. Like I say, you have to drop it every once in a while.
I always wondered, what were they in the woods? I got a medieval lifestyle.
Could be. People are often discovered as the woods.
Yeah.
Hansel and Gretel and all that kind of stuff. So it's not only that it's possible a lifetime, it's also possible that when he comes back around, that he will
I told his mother, worry about it. She's all right. He's gonna go that way, but I'm not going back. I just, he's got the we roll at least somewhere.
Michael would have a way.
Just like
She's messy on some kind of
Yes, Thursday.
Family is the most
But I think in the future we're gonna merge it with so it's
Look forward to seeing you next time.
I really enjoyed it yesterday. But my mind when I left here was starting to get. I remember that. voted for worship.
Okay. And things are coming back to my head. And of course, I lost a lot of stuff with the two shops that I had. And I'm trying to get those memories
Well, I was
back.
just telling you, I'm having cake.
Well, those lots of
I
things
will
are
get
like-
one and drive it
Oh,
back.
yeah. The stroke is a physical thing that the body can heal.
I was talking about
Oh, boy.
Great. Keep up the good work.
That sounds like something.
and I'll be back to see you. Thank you so much.
You're sure welcome.
Nice to meet you. And an editing go or Viking show? Oh, I read everything about the Vikings. I love the Vikings.
We're so glad to have you come down. I think we talked longer. It's like,
Thank you so much.
I know.
Well, you're welcome. Yeah, I had lots of other notes I skipped over from.
Skip that.
I was watching the clock.
Yeah.
Who
Might-
says
we
you
always
have to be on
enjoy it.
time?
Yeah.
Who's the time Nazi around here?
Hmm.
Who's the time Nazi around here? Who says you have to be on time?
Yesterday was a lot of fun too.
Yeah.
The title of my note says education.
Don't say that. No, take care.
All right.